Hello, and welcome to Turkey Abroad. My name is Nicholas Morgan, and I'm an editor at Alval News. And today, joining me as my guest is Engin Yüksel, a research fellow at the Klingendale Institute of International Relationship at The Hague in the Netherlands. Engin, welcome to Turkey Abroad.
Thank you, Nicholas, for giving me the floor in Ahval Turkey Abroad.
So the topic that I brought Engin on to talk about today is on Turkey's use of Syrians as part of its foreign policy in places like Libya and now in Nagorno-Karabakh. There's been a lot of information that has come out about these deployments. Initially, it was mixed with many denials from the local governments that are allied to Turkey and Turkey itself, but owing to a lot of diligent reporting and open source research, we can now safely say that Turkey has been deploying these Syrians wherever that they have an interest in achieving a military goal on the ground to facilitate a wider diplomatic victory or foreign policy objective. And we know that Turkey has long been a host and an organizer of Syrian rebels fighting in the civil war against Bashar al-Assad since the very beginning. And over time, it took on the role of the primary sponsor for these groups. So Engin, I want to ask you if you can give our listeners a bit of a history on Turkey's development into this role from just one among many different supporters to the Syrian opposition to becoming the main backer of many groups that it can now send to other regions that it's interested in achieving a goal.
Of course, indeed, Turkey's backing for the armed Syrian opposition started in 2011 when the Syrian regime turned a deaf ear on Turkey's proposal to enact structural political reforms. Following this, Ankara aimed at overthrowing the Syrian regime by rendering assistance to the Free Syrian Army, an umbrella group which was founded in 2011 in Turkey by Sunni Arab defectors of the Syrian Arab Army. Indeed, the Free Syrian Army has been the armed opposition group mostly aligned with Turkey throughout the Syrian civil war. In this context, the group took sanctuary in Turkey, built strong networks with the Western and Gulf representatives, and benefited from US-led train and equip program in 2014 to accelerate the overthrow of the Assad regime. Against this backdrop, Turkey's early arrangement with the Free Syrian Army could be analyzed within the framework of donated assistance strategy, since Ankara didn't fully direct the actions of the group up until 2016. The strategy became ineffective for several reasons. Firstly, the Free Syrian Army was an umbrella organization that suffered from infighting between different factions. Furthermore, the group was exposed to geopolitical politicking at the outset of the Syrian civil war, with several Gulf states competing for influence. Therefore, it became very difficult for Turkey to attain its desirable objectives through the use of donated assistance strategy, especially when Kurdish Democratic Party PYD gradually started posing an existential threat to Ankara in 2015. At the same time, Turkey shifted its priority from unseating the Assad regime to containing and undoing the gains of the PYD. Afterwards, Turkey has developed a control through centralization approach towards the Syrian opposition in order to carry out an effective proxy war strategy. By this means, Turkey aimed at restructuring the armed Syrian opposition based on conventional brigade corps architecture. Furthermore, Turkey provided the armed Syrian opposition with training, salaries, weapons in return for its participation in Turkish military operations. In this context, the armed Syrian opposition took part in Turkish military incursions in Syria in 2016, 2018, and 2019. This strategy has been operationalized through a hybrid warfare approach that combines Turkish military forces with irregular capabilities in the form of Syrian armed groups acting as Turkish proxies. This approach has been relatively effective in carving out substantial areas of Turkish influence and control along the Turkish-Syrian border, and in disrupting the emergence of a continuous area controlled by the PYD-led Syrian Kurds. Thereby, Turkey succeeded in controlling the armed Syrian opposition in a gradual manner by centralizing and restructuring the armed groups, even though it was placed under the Ministry of Defense of the Syrian interim government.
So one of the common labels that is often slapped onto the Syrian fighters is that they are jihadists. We've seen the accusation against them come when they deployed in Libya to fight against General Haftar, and then the Armenian government has described them as such now in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I feel that a lot of this association with that label comes from the fact that you had factions such as the Al-Nusra Front, which is then split into, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other groups that are openly embracing some of this jihadist ideology. But then you also have a number of these other factions within the Syrian National Army that are less jihadist, and they have a number of other sort of motivations. So I want to ask if you can also now tell us a little more about these ideologies or motivations behind Syria, the Syrians that are fighting for Turkey now.
Yes, indeed, as you suggested, the armed Syrian opposition does not represent a monolithic entity, since it has been subjected to a constant process of fragmentation since the early stages of the Syrian civil war. Actually, the armed Syrian opposition can be categorized in three main clusters, namely secular revolutionary groups, nationalist Islamist groups, and Salafi jihadist groups, considering their ideological differences. The secular revolutionary category of the armed Syrian opposition contains groups that do not have an overt religious agenda and that were formed during the revolution against the Assad regime. This category includes Turkmen proxy groups represented by the Syrian Turkmen Assembly based in northwest Syria. The second category of the Syrian armed opposition includes nationalist Islamists groups. They have also become known as moderate Islamists and now are located in the Idlib province of Syria. While nationalist Islamist groups officially sought to establish a Syrian Islamic State in which governance was supervised by religious scholars and based on Sharia law, it distanced itself from the Salafi jihadi doctrine. The result was a Syrian-focused nationalistic agenda with religious but not radical extremist overtones. Thanks to the Gulf and the Turkish support, these groups arguably became more effective in Syria from 2015 onwards. In October 2019, just 5 days ahead of Turkey's military incursion called Peace Spring, Turkey succeeded in merging nationalist Islamists with secular revolutionary groups and formed the Syrian National Army. Since then, the Syrian National Army has become the dominant core of the Turkish proxy architecture in Syria. Regarding Salafists, this is a third category. The third category of armed Syrian opposition constitutes the Salafi jihadist groups. This category is limited to the Islamic State and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a former Al-Qaeda affiliate who controlled the Idlib province of Syria. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham rejected to associate itself with Turkish-backed proxy architecture. The group also limits its collaboration with Turkish-backed proxies when the Syrian regime unleashes a major offensive. Thus, we can say that the group ensures some sort of independence in Idlib. In return, Turkey has developed a cautious divide and rule approach toward the group. Since then, Ankara has managed to ensure a covert cooperation with the pragmatist wing of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. On the other hand, the more extreme wing of the group, called Tanzim Huras al-Din, has continued to criticize the group breaking up from Al-Qaeda discourse and its collaboration with Turkey. Even though Turkey seeks to merge the pragmatic wing of the group with its proxy architecture in Syria, namely Syrian National Army, until now, the group has managed to ensure its independence in Idlib.
And it sounds to me that this is the strategy that Turkey has been relying on consistently at Idlib to uphold the conditions of its agreements with Russia, because Russia is another one who frequently uses the label of jihadists or terrorists whenever it is whenever it is in the opening stages of a new campaign in Idlib. It's always preceded by this rhetoric that these groups are still there and that Turkey is not doing enough to get rid of them. In the beginning, it seemed that they were primarily speaking about, Nusra Front, and then it began to develop, of course, into Haras al-Din. And do you see how do you see Turkey's strategy in Idlib using these groups? Do you think it's been successful in upholding those agreements with Russia, or do you think that Russia and the regime will always use just their existence and justify them as terrorists to launch new operations in Idlib?
Yes, Idlib, the Turkish policy towards Idlib is very complicated issue due to the presence of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and also the Tanzim Huras al-Din. And Turkish policy from the beginning not to confront with this group and adopt a divide and rule approach to find a ways to collaborate with the pragmatic wing and merge it with the Syrian National Army. On the other hand, the presence of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is recognized by Russia and US as a terrorist organization, gives the Russia and Syrian regime a perfect pretext to launch its military operations in Syria. So, however, despite the presence of a ceasefire at the moment, since March 2020, the radical elements of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and as well as the Syrian regime starts doing daily clashes against each other, which endangers the presence of ceasefire in the region.
Rewinding a little bit to the motivation factor, we talk now about the motivations and ideologies of the groups themselves, but what is it that motivates them to then serve as Turkey's proxies, like when they're recruited and then later deployed to places like Libya or Nagorno-Karabakh? Commonly, it's usually portrayed as economic desperation, essentially, and that's led to them to adopt another label, of course, and that's as mercenaries. It's out of they're seen as jihadists, or they're seen as mercenaries. But what to you is the best answer for their motivations to be shipped abroad, further away from Syria, to go fight in these places for Turkey?
I think the material motivations plays a vital role for Syrians to accept Turkish offer to fight in Libya and now in Azerbaijan. The Syrian National Army fighters live in a narrow stretch of land along the Turkish-Syrian border where Turkey has effective control. They are disconnected from traditional sources of income, and they have insufficient support network to live and pay their rents. Therefore, the living situation in northern Syria and unemployment forced some individual members of the Turkish-backed groups to accept the Turkish offer to fight in Libya and Azerbaijan. When Turkey first created the framework of its Syrian factions in 2016, the salaries offered to fighters were about $300 per month paid in Turkish lira. Over time, salaries have declined, and by the beginning of 2019, salaries had been cut to about $50 per month. Therefore, it's plausible to argue that the SNA fighters are motivated to take part in Libya essentially by the desire for private gain. Against this backdrop, Ankara has exploited this situation by offering monthly salaries of $2,000 and $3,000 Libyan money by means of 3 to 6 monthly contracts to those who would like to participate in the Libyan war. Likewise, Syrian fighters have been offered about $1,000 to $2,000 in Azerbaijan. Furthermore, Turkey has promised these volunteers Turkish nationality, medical support for the injured, and repatriation aid for the dead. While secular revolutionary and national Islamist armed groups have interested in this offer, the Salafi jihadists have not paid any attention to it. In my view, Salafi jihadists have not taken part in the war in Libya or in Azerbaijan. There's also another factor. Shared Islamic perspective may also play a role for Syrians to join the war in Libya and Azerbaijan. Some Syrians argued that the presence of a shared religious vision fed by political Islam has given them enough motivation to fight abroad for the interests of Turkey. I will think that religious is more likely a background factor enabling the collaboration between Turkey and Syrian fighters deployed in Libya and Azerbaijan, but it is not a driver.
Yeah, and that's a really important aspect to point out because, of course, especially with the sensitivities that surround the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh, there's been an attempt in some areas to portray it as almost like a civilizational struggle in a way, Christianity against vis-a-vis Islam, and it just doesn't. It seems to come up around because of all of the conflicting narratives that are going on related to conflict, but it doesn't really strike me as the primary driver that it has to do as much with religion as it does to do with unsettled territorial claims or between the Armenians and the Azerbaijan sides. And I want to touch on Nagorno-Karabakh. I want to ask you something, and it's one of the criticisms to the initial assumption that Turkey was sending soldiers from Syria to go fight in whether it was Nagorno-Karabakh or Libya beforehand was questioned about their military effectiveness by many analysts. They were suggesting that in Libya's case, they would be primarily used as, say, cannon fodder. They were questioning the military utility of sending these forces there in the first place. Then, of course, these questions came back when they were identified in Azerbaijan, because, of course, Baku has a very large and modern army, that the question of why these fighters would be needed or sent there in the first place was an open question. So I want to ask, how has their military effectiveness really been for Turkey? What makes this strategy effective for Ankara to pursue?
A great question. We are now talking about a force that consisted of 7 corps and about 80,000 fighters. And this force is a mix of former rebels and newly recruited fighters. Former rebels had received support from Turkey, the Gulf countries, and CIA until 2015. After 2015, new factions were formed by using Ottoman and Turkish names in anticipation of Turkish military incursion into Syria. Therefore, the post-2015 recruits were relatively inexperienced and were motivated to take part in the Syrian civil war, essentially by the desire for monthly wages. Therefore, the majority of fighters today appear to be newer recruits without any previous battlefield experience. According to some estimates, new recruits constitutes about 60% of the Syrian National Army. Against this backdrop, Turkey has taken several measures to improve the SNA's combat effectiveness. First and foremost, Ankara has gradually turned these groups into a centralized organization with clearer command and control architecture since 2016. However, this is not to say that these groups are not irregular. And secondly, the Turkish army has attempted to address the issue of Syrian National Army's compatibility with Turkish army conventional operations. This is due to the fact that these groups took part in Turkish military interventions as irregular component. In this regard, some selected units of the Syrian National Army, such as Hamza Division or Sultan Murat Division, conducted military drills and equipped with Turkish infantry armored personnel carriers. However, it is not correct to think that all groups equally benefit from Turkish military backing. And due to the presence of considerable Turkmens among the rank and file, secular revolutionary groups are more prone to accept Turkish military patronage. And furthermore, we cannot claim that the Mercenaries has also taken the same military backing as the ones who has was participated in Turkish military operations. And apart from this, reports also have suggested that ordinary Syrians who are not the members of the Syrian National Army have also joined the war in Azerbaijan without any training and battle experience. Some Syrians made contracts with Turkish security companies that have projects in Azerbaijan with gas and oil and contracting companies. When they first registered, no military operations were taking place in Azerbaijan. Afterward, they found themselves in the battlefront. Generally speaking, the Syrian National Army are less capable to fight against conventional armies, especially in the areas like Azerbaijan, without a Turkish military backing.
Earlier, you described this as, very interestingly as a hybrid warfare strategy, and of course, when the word hybrid warfare is used, it usually conjures images of Russia and its use of the Wagner company and its operations in Ukraine, where when they seized Crimea. So I just really would like to know, is this a relatively new shift for Turkey to have adopted this doctrine of a hybrid warfare approach to war fighting in places like Syria, Libya, and now Azerbaijan?
Of course, there are different aspects because Turkey has no hybrid warfare doctrine, but the conditions of the Syrian war, the capacity problems, and also the war conditions may force Turkey to choose the option to use irregular forces during their military operations, whether it is called hybrid warfare, whether it is you can use another term. However, we can definitely talk about a Turkish approach to using proxies in the battlefield since 2015. And one of the key components of this is that the Syrian National Army groups has taken part in the Turkish military conventional operations to attain a common objective. So this is unprecedented considering Turkish military history.
Okay, and this dovetails into my final question, and that has to do with the long-term implications of Turkey's use of these Syrians to fight in places that it is interested in, such as Libya or now Azerbaijan, of course, because I read an analysis recently in Foreign Policy that suggested that even as Turkey's economy comes under a lot of increasing pressure, whether it's from the decline of the lira and then, of course, COVID-19, that this more muscular foreign policy will continue. And in the beginning, it seemed that using the Syrian mercenaries to go to these places was to provide a level of cost effectiveness, of course, and plausible deniability. Of course, by now, the plausible deniability is long gone, and the cost effectiveness is still there. But do you foresee any sort of long-term role in using these proxies across regions that Turkey begins to invest itself in? Or do you think as conditions ultimately end up changing, say in Syria, that Turkey will inevitably abandon this practice?
I think Ankara has a strategy which seeks to make use of the Syrian armed opposition to attain its foreign policy objectives in its near abroad. Turkish-backed armed groups plays an important role for Turkey while it attempts to control events in its near and far abroad. And this strategy seeks to utilize these groups as the irregular element in realization of Turkey's safe zone policy in northern Syria. Turkish-backed armed groups help create 3 semi-autonomous Turkish protectorates in northern Syria against the backdrop of undoing and containing the gains of the PYD. Therefore, this force structure augments Turkey's military deterrence posture, which is necessary to influence the course of the Syrian civil war in favor of Turkish objectives. And in far abroad, the Syrian fighters make up for Turkish government's political unwillingness to deploy Turkish army to a foreign country. And as you mentioned, the use of Syrians in foreign countries gives Ankara plausible deniability not to provoke its adversaries. However, this strategy is not without its difficulties. First of all, Turkish-backed groups repeatedly committed the war crimes in northern Syria, according to the UN Special Inquiry Commission recent report dating 15 September. Even more importantly, the report further suggests that the Turkish army has failed to intervene in human rights abuses and may have violated Turkey's obligations to ensure the public order and safety in the areas under effective Turkish control. This report indicates that the policy of ensuring public order and safety in northern Syria through the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army is challenging and unsustainable. Secondly, the use of mercenaries in an armed conflict is prohibited by the United Nations. According to the UN 2001 Convention, state parties shall not recruit, use, finance, and train mercenaries in an armed conflict. Turkey and the majority of the world's countries are not signatory to the convention. However, this shall not give the states full impunity from misery and death induced by the use of mercenaries.
And Yakshel, it's been a pleasure to have you, and I really appreciate your time. I definitely hope that you rejoin me on Turkey Abroad in the future.
Thank you so much.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.